He thought he had won the divorce of the century, keeping his millions and throwing his cheating wife out on the street. But 3 years later, billionaire Michael Harrison discovers the terrifying truth that turns his victory into a nightmare. He finds his ex-wife, Emily, not living in luxury with a lover as he suspected, but starving in a council flat, maintaining a dignity that cuts him to the bone. The twist? The man who showed him the proof of her affair was his own best friend, Julian, who hired deepfake artists to frame her. What happens when Michael uncovers the conspiracy is the most satisfying public takedown you will ever witness. But don't click away, because the real ending isn't the revenge on the friend. It is what Emily does when Michael begs her to come back and offers her $25 million. Her answer redefines the word revenge. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse, not with anger, but with a relentless, weeping monotony that blurred the lights of London into streaks of bleeding neon. Michael Harrison stood with his back to the warmth of the room, staring out at the city he effectively owned. From this height, the people below were insignificant ants, scurrying through the storm, their lives dictated by the frantic need to survive. Michael did not need to survive. He had conquered. At 35 years old, he was the undisputed king of the Harrison Luxury Group, a hospitality empire that stretched from the vineyards of Tuscany to the skyscrapers of New York. Yet, as he pressed his hand against the cold glass, the condensation chilling his fingertips, he felt a profound and echoing hollowness that no amount of acquisition could fill. The room behind him was a masterpiece of modern interior design. It was a study in grays and blacks, sharp angles, and Italian leather, a space that was undeniably masculine and aggressively expensive. It was also completely devoid of life. There were no photographs on the mantel. There were no soft throws on the sofa. It was a showroom, not a home, maintained with a sterility that bordered on obsessive. This was the kingdom he had fought for in the divorce. This was the prize. You are brooding again, Michael. It does not suit you. It ruins the line of that bespoke suit. The voice cut through the silence, smooth and rich like melted chocolate, but with an underlying aftertaste of something metallic. Michael turned to face Julian Wright. Julian was lounging on the sprawling leather sofa, legs crossed at the ankle, holding a crystal glass of Michael's rarest vintage red wine. As always, Julian was impeccably dressed, his velvet blazer catching the dim light, his smile practiced and dazzling. He was the most sought-after wedding planner in the country, a man who spun fairy tales for the elite, yet he spent more time in Michael's dark penthouse than in any ballroom. I am not brooding, Michael replied, his voice low and controlled. He walked over to the mahogany bar and poured himself a whiskey, skipping the ice. I am simply thinking. The quarterly reports are due tomorrow. Julian laughed softly, a sound that lacked genuine mirth. Please. The reports are perfect. They always are. You have posted record profits for 3 consecutive years. Ever since. Well, ever since you trimmed the fat. The air in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. They did not say her name. They never said her name. But she was there, a ghost haunting the negative space of the conversation. Emily. It had been exactly 3 years to the day since the final gavel fell. 3 years since Michael had stood in that sterile courtroom, armed with the dossier Julian had provided, the damning photographs, the hotel receipts, the testimony of staff members who claimed to have seen Emily entering the room of a nameless lover. Michael remembered the rage that had coursed through his veins then, a white-hot fire that consumed his reason. He had wanted to destroy her. He had wanted to see her beg. But she had not begged. That was the memory that kept Michael awake at 3 in the morning. When the judge asked Emily Foster if she contested the evidence, she had simply looked at Michael. Her eyes, usually so full of warmth and wit, were dead. She looked at him not with guilt, but with a profound, shattering disappointment. She had signed the papers, accepting a settlement that was a fraction of what she deserved, and walked out of the courtroom without a backward glance. She had taken nothing. No alimony. No property. Just her maiden name. She would have destroyed this company, Julian said, as if reading Michael's thoughts. He swirled his wine, watching the red liquid coat the glass. Emily was soft, Michael. She lacked the vision. And let us be honest, her infidelity was just a symptom of her ingratitude. You gave her the world, and she looked for cheap thrills in a motel room. Michael took a long swallow of whiskey, the burn welcome against his throat. The evidence was conclusive, Michael said, though the words felt like a recitation rather than a conviction. I saw the photos, Julian. You did, Julian affirmed, standing up and walking over to place a reassuring hand on Michael's shoulder. And I did what a best friend does. I protected you. Look at you now. You are unburdened. You are the most eligible bachelor in Europe. We have the gala next week, and I have arranged the seating chart. The daughter of the steel magnate will be on your right. She is charming, and unlike some people, she understands the value of loyalty. Michael stepped away from Julian's touch, moving toward the heavy oak cabinet that housed his private collection of watches. He felt a sudden, inexplicable need to be alone, to scrub the scent of Julian's expensive cologne from the air. I am tired, Julian. Leave the seating chart on the desk. I will review it in the morning. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing, before the mask of the concerned friend slipped back into place. Of course. You work too hard. Get some rest, Michael. We have an empire to run. When the elevator doors finally slid shut, sealing Julian out, the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. Michael exhaled a breath he did not realize he had been holding. He set his glass down on the cabinet and noticed that one of the heavy drawers was slightly ajar. Frowning, he pushed it, but something was jamming the mechanism from the inside. Irritated, Michael pulled the drawer all the way out, reaching into the dark crevice behind the tracks. His fingers brushed against something small and cold. He pulled it out and held it up to the light. It was a cufflink. It was not one of his diamond-encrusted pairs, nor was it the platinum set he wore for board meetings. It was a simple, silver cufflink shaped like a small paper airplane. It was cheap, tarnished, and utterly out of place in this room of gold and marble. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. 5 years ago, before the empire had grown so large, he had been stressed about a merger, on the verge of a panic attack. Emily had walked in, not with business advice, but with a small gift box. Because you are always flying away from me, she had whispered, fastening them onto his shirt. This is so you remember to always fly back home. Michael stared at the silver airplane in his palm. Julian had told him that Emily mocked his ambition behind his back. Julian had told him that she spent his money on frivolous things while he worked. But this object was not frivolous. It was intimate. It was a piece of a woman who loved him for the man he was, not the checkbook he carried. He rubbed his thumb over the tarnished metal. If she was the cold, calculating cheater Julian described, the woman who laughed at him with her lover, why did this small, hidden object make his chest ache with a pain that felt dangerously like regret? The narrative he had built his life upon for the past 3 years suddenly felt fragile, like a crack appearing in a dam. He gripped the cufflink tightly, the metal digging into his skin. For the first time in 3 years, Michael Harrison did not feel like a winner. He felt like a man who had woken up in a stranger's house, holding the key to a door that no longer existed. The silver cufflink had remained in Michael's pocket for the entire week, a small, hard weight against his thigh that served as a constant, nagging reminder of a past he had tried to incinerate. Now, standing in the ballroom of the Dorchester Hotel in London, surrounded by the glitterati of European society, Michael felt that weight heavier than ever. The Royal Charity Gala was the event of the season, a kaleidoscope of diamonds, silk, and hollow compliments. The air smelled of expensive perfume and ambition. Waiters moved like ghosts through the crowd, offering champagne with practiced invisibility, while a string quartet played something classical and inoffensive in the corner. Julian was in his element. He flitted from group to group, a social butterfly with wings of velvet and malice, charming the wives of bankers and whispering gossip into the ears of politicians. Michael watched him from the edge of the room, feeling a strange disconnect. Usually, he reveled in this, the power, the networking, the acknowledgement that he was the apex predator in the room. Tonight, however, the champagne tasted flat, and the laughter sounded shrill. Despite his mood, Michael's professional instincts remained sharp. He was a hotelier down to his marrow, and he could not help but critique the event. And to his surprise, he found nothing to criticize. The flow of the evening was impeccable. The lighting transitioned subtly as the mood shifted from cocktails to dinner. The service was not just efficient, it was telepathic. He watched a waiter catch a falling napkin before it hit the floor, replacing it instantly without the guest even noticing. The timing of the courses was synchronized to the second. It was a ballet of logistics that Michael knew required a mastermind to orchestrate. Impressive, Michael murmured to himself. He needed talent like this for the Harrison Group. His current events director in New York was competent, but this was artistry. He scanned the room for Julian, intending to ask who the organizer was, but Julian had disappeared into the VIP lounge with a minor royal. Impatient and driven by a sudden curiosity, Michael decided to find out for himself. He bypassed the head waiter and moved toward the service entrance, the heavy velvet curtains parting to swallow him into the backstage world. The transition was jarring. The hushed elegance of the ballroom vanished, replaced by the harsh, fluorescent glare of the service corridor. The air here was hot and thick with the sense of roasting duck, reduction sauces, and adrenaline. It was a cacophony of shouting chefs, clattering dishes, and the frantic energy of 100 staff members working at the limit of human endurance. Michael navigated the chaos, his tuxedo looking absurdly out of place against the sea of white aprons and black uniforms. He was looking for the conductor of this madness. He found her near the pass, a narrow station where the kitchen met the service floor. She was standing with her back to him, barking orders into a headset while simultaneously checking a clipboard and inspecting a tray of hors d'oeuvres. She wore simple black slacks and a fitted black shirt, the universal uniform of the service industry, invisible. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, practical bun, not a stray strand allowed to escape. Table 12 needs water. Now. And tell the lighting booth to dim the spots on the podium in 3, 2, 1. Go. The voice stopped Michael dead in his tracks. It was a voice he had heard whisper, "I love you," in the dark. It was a voice he had heard scream in agony during a miscarriage. It was a voice he had heard plead for belief in a cold courtroom. He felt the blood drain from his face, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was impossible. Julian had told him she was in the south of France, living off a wealthy artist. Julian had said she was happy, carefree, spending her days on yachts. The woman turned around. It was Emily. But it was not the Emily he remembered. The woman who stood before him was thinner, her cheekbones sharper, casting severe shadows under the harsh kitchen lights. The softness that used to define her features had been eroded, replaced by a steeliness that was almost frightening. There were dark circles under her eyes, not concealed by makeup, but worn like bruises of exhaustion. Her hands, which used to be manicured and soft, were rough, the fingers clutching a pen with white-knuckled intensity. She looked tired. She looked worn. But she also looked formidable. She saw him. For a moment, the chaos around them seemed to fall silent. The shouting chefs, the clattering plates, it all faded into a dull roar. Michael waited for the reaction. He expected her to flinch. He expected fear, or perhaps the flashy anger of a woman scorned. He expected her to run. She did none of those things. Emily simply looked at him. Her eyes, once the warm brown of autumn leaves, were now flat and opaque. There was no spark of recognition, no flicker of old love, not even hatred. She looked at him with the same detached assessment she had given the tray of hors d'oeuvres. To her, in that moment, Michael Harrison was just another obstacle in her timeline, a piece of debris she needed to navigate around to get the dessert course out on time. "You are blocking the corridor," she said. Her voice was cool, stripped of any emotion. It was professional. It was devastating. Michael opened his mouth, but his throat felt dry. "Emily," he managed to rasp out. You are working here?" "I am the event director," she corrected him, looking down at her clipboard. "And we are behind schedule on the speeches. Please move, Mr. Harrison. Guests are not allowed back of house." "Mr. Harrison." "Not Michael. Not darling. Mr. Harrison." The formality was a knife twisting in his gut. Julian told me. Michael started, though he did not know how to finish the sentence. Julian told me you were living in luxury. Julian told me you took a payoff from a lover. Julian told me you were laughing at me. I do not care what Julian told you, she said, her eyes finally locking onto his, and for a split second, Michael saw the flash of incredible pain buried deep beneath the ice. If you have a complaint about the service, take it up with the hotel management tomorrow. Right now, I have a job to do. She moved to step around him, brushing past his shoulder. The scent of her hit him, not the expensive floral perfume he used to buy her, but the smell of soap, paper, and hard work. It was the scent of survival. Before Michael could reach out to stop her, the heavy swing doors behind him burst open. Julian came rushing in, his face flushed, his eyes darting frantically around the corridor until they landed on the tableau of Michael and Emily. The look on Julian's face was one Michael had never seen before. It was sheer, unadulterated panic. Michael, Julian gasped, rushing forward and physically grabbing Michael's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. I have been looking everywhere for you. The Duchess is asking for you. We must go. Now. Julian refused to look at Emily. He kept his body angled to block Michael's view of her, acting as a frantic shield. Come on, Michael. This is not the place for you. It is dirty back here. Emily did not move. She watched Julian with a gaze that was terrifying in its calmness. She did not scream at the man who had ruined her life. She simply watched him squirm. Hello, Julian, Emily said softly. Julian flinched as if he had been struck. He tugged harder on Michael's arm. Ignore her, Michael. She is just trying to cause a scene. You know how she is. Manipulative. Come away. Michael looked from Julian's sweaty, terrified face to Emily's cold, dignified silence. The contrast was jarring. The narrative in his head, the one where Emily was the villain and Julian the savior, trembled violently. Why was Julian so afraid? Why was Emily working 16-hour shifts if she was supposed to be a gold digger? I am not causing a scene, Julian, Emily said, turning her back on them to signal a waiter. I am working. Something you would know nothing about. Let us go, Julian hissed, practically dragging Michael toward the door. Michael allowed himself to be pulled away, but as he passed through the velvet curtains back into the world of light and lies, he looked back over his shoulder. Emily was already back on the headset, commanding the room, a lonely figure in black holding the entire world together with nothing but her will. She did not look back at him. The image of Emily standing in the harsh, fluorescent glare of the hotel kitchen, her hands red and chapped, refused to leave Michael's mind. It burned behind his eyelids every time he blinked, a persistent afterimage that made the spreadsheet figures on his laptop screen blur into insignificance. 3 days had passed since the gala, and Michael had not slept more than a handful of fragmented hours. He sat in his parked Bentley, the engine idling with a low, barely perceptible hum, hidden in the shadows of a side street across from the service entrance of the Dorchester. It was raining again, a cold, miserable London drizzle that turned the pavement into a slick, black mirror. Michael felt a wave of self-loathing wash over him. He was the CEO of a multinational corporation, a man who commanded thousands, yet here he was, reduced to a voyeur, stalking his ex-wife like a jealous teenager. But he had to know. Julian's narrative of Emily's life, the yachts, the artist lover, the carefree spending, had shattered the moment Michael saw the exhaustion etched into the lines of her face. He needed to reconcile the two versions of the truth before he lost his mind. At 1 a.m., the heavy metal doors swung open. A trickle of staff members emerged, pulling up collars against the chill. Then came Emily. She was alone. She wore a shapeless gray wool coat that looked at least 5 years old, the hem slightly frayed. She didn't look for a taxi. She didn't check her phone for a driver. She simply pulled a scarf tighter around her neck and began to walk toward the bus stop, her head bowed against the wind. Michael signaled his driver to follow, keeping a safe distance. He watched through the tinted glass as she waited for the night bus. When it arrived, she boarded, scanning her pass with the weary automaticity of someone who did this every single day. Michael's car glided alongside the bus, a shark swimming beside a trawler. He watched her profile through the rain-streaked windows of the public transport. She wasn't texting anyone. She wasn't smiling. She was staring blankly at the dark city, her reflection ghosting against the glass, looking utterly, devastatingly alone. They traveled out of the wealthy heart of London, past the manicured squares of Chelsea, past the trendy bustle of Shoreditch, into the gray, concrete sprawl of the outer boroughs. The streets became narrower, the buildings grimmer. Finally, she got off in a neighborhood Michael had never set foot in, a place of peeling paint, flickering streetlights, and 24-hour kebab shops. He watched her walk into a small convenience store. She emerged moments later carrying a single plastic bag. Through the translucent plastic, he could see a carton of milk, a loaf of discounted bread, and a single apple. The sight hit Michael with the force of a physical blow to the solar plexus. This was the woman he had accused of marrying him for his fortune? This was the greedy ex-wife Julian had saved him from? She unlocked the door to a faded brick apartment complex that looked like it hadn't seen a renovation since the 80s. No doorman, no security, just a heavy door that slammed shut, swallowing her into the dark. Michael sat in the Bentley for a long time, staring at the building. On the third floor, a single light flickered on. He imagined her up there, unpacking her meager groceries, perhaps boiling water for tea in a kettle that whistled too loudly. The contrast between her reality and his penthouse, with its heated floors and silent servants, was nauseating. If she had truly taken a payout from a lover, as Julian had claimed, where was the money? Where was the lover? The next morning, Michael did not go to the office. Instead, he drove to a nondescript cafe in Southwark to meet a man named Thorne. Thorne was a private investigator, but not one on the Harrison Group's payroll. Michael had specifically sought someone outside of his circle, someone Julian Wright had never met and could not influence. Thorne was a man of few words, with eyes that looked like they had seen too much of the world's ugliness. He slid a thick manila envelope across the scarred wooden table. "You asked me to look into the man in the photographs," Thorne said, his voice gravelly. "The one your wife was allegedly sleeping with 3 years ago. Alessandro Rossi." Michael's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the envelope. "And, did you find him? Is he still in France?" Thorne took a slow sip of his black coffee, watching Michael with a look of pity that Michael found infuriating. "I found him, Mr. Harrison, but he's not in France. And he's definitely not sleeping with your ex-wife." Michael ripped the envelope open. Inside was a single, laminated document and a glossy photograph of a headstone. "Alessandro Rossi died in a motorcycle accident in Milan 4 years ago," Thorne stated flatly. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The noise of the cafe, the hiss of the espresso machine, the chatter of patrons, dropped away into a buzzing silence. Michael stared at the death certificate. The date of death was stamped clearly, August 14th, 2019. "That's impossible," Michael whispered, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. The photos of him and Emily were taken in 2020. I saw the timestamps. I saw them entering the hotel room together. The man in the photos was real enough, Thorne explained, pointing to a second photo in the file. It was a picture of a struggling actor named David Miller. But his face was digitally altered to look like Rossi, probably because Rossi was a known playboy and it fit the narrative. And this actor? He admitted he was paid £5,000 to walk into a hotel room with a woman who looked like your wife, wait 10 minutes, and leave. He never even spoke to her. He didn't know he was being photographed. Michael felt the bile rise in his throat. "A woman who looked like my wife. A body double," Thorne said. "Or deepfake technology. It's not hard to do these days if you have the money and the motive." "The photos you used in court? They were fabrications, Mr. Harrison. Masterful ones, but fakes nonetheless." Michael gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. The implications crashed into him like a tidal wave. Alessandro was dead before the affair supposedly began. The photos were staged. The evidence that had turned his heart to stone, the evidence that had made him throw the love of his life out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on her back, it was all a lie. And there was only one person who had discovered that evidence. Only one person who had brought the photos to Michael, his face a mask of sympathetic grief, urging him to file for divorce immediately to protect the assets. Julian. A cold, deadly clarity settled over Michael. He thought of Emily's silence in court. She hadn't fought back because she was guilty. She hadn't fought back because she was in shock. She had been framed by his best friend, and her husband, the man who had vowed to trust and cherish her, had believed the lie without a second thought. Is there anything else? Michael asked, his voice deadly calm, though a storm was raging beneath his skin. One more thing, Thorne said, sliding a final piece of paper across the table. I tracked the payment to the actor, David Miller. It came from a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. But the initial funding for that shell company? It was transferred from a personal account in London. Michael looked at the bank transfer record. The name on the account was not a surprise anymore. It was a confirmation of a betrayal so deep it felt like a physical dismemberment. Julian Wright. Michael stood up, leaving the envelope on the table but taking the death certificate. He walked out of the cafe into the gray London afternoon. The rain had stopped, but the air felt heavy, charged with electricity. He didn't go to his car immediately. He stood on the sidewalk, breathing in the damp air, feeling the tectonic plates of his life shifting violently. He had destroyed an innocent woman. He had let a viper sleep in his house, drink his wine, and whisper poison in his ear. Michael Harrison checked his watch. He had a meeting with Julian in 2 hours to discuss the expansion of the banquet halls. He would go to that meeting. He would shake Julian's hand. He would smile. But behind his eyes, the man who had been a victim was gone. In his place was a man who had built an empire on ruthlessness, and for the first time in 3 years, he knew exactly where to direct it. Michael Harrison returned to his penthouse, the silence of the apartment no longer feeling like peace, but like a vacuum waiting to be filled with the screams of his past. He walked straight to the wall safe concealed behind a modernist painting of a storm-tossed sea, an ironic reflection of his current state of mind. His fingers moved mechanically over the keypad, punching in a code he had not changed in 10 years. The heavy steel door swung open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing the neatly stacked rows of his most sensitive documents, deeds, bonds, and the thick, black leather folder that contained the autopsy of his marriage. He took the folder to his mahogany desk and switched on the single brass lamp. The pool of yellow light illuminated the glossy photographs that had once served as his executioner's axe. He spread them out. There was the man, Alessandro Rossi, leaning intimately toward a woman who looked exactly like Emily. There was the hand on her waist. There was the entry into the hotel elevator. 3 days ago, these images were proof of betrayal. Tonight, under the unforgiving glare of the lamp and the weight of the death certificate in his pocket, they looked like what they were, a stage play. He looked closer, squinting at the details he had been too angry to notice 3 years ago. The woman's hair was styled like Emily's, yes, but the posture was wrong. Emily stood with a dancer's grace, her shoulders always back. This woman slouched slightly. And the jewelry. He brought the photo closer to his eyes. The woman was wearing a bracelet on her right wrist. Emily was left-handed. She always wore her watch and bracelets on her left to keep her writing hand free. How had he missed this? The answer whispered through the room, carrying the scent of expensive cologne and betrayal. Julian. Michael closed his eyes, and the memory washed over him, visceral and nauseating. He was transported back 3 years, to a rainy Tuesday, much like this one. He was sitting in this very chair when Julian had walked in, his face a mask of pained reluctance. I do not know how to tell you this, Michael, Julian had said, placing the envelope on the desk as if it were a bomb. I hesitated. I almost burned them. But you are my brother. I cannot let her make a fool of you. Michael remembered the way his own hands had shaken as he opened the envelope. He remembered the roaring sound in his ears that drowned out rational thought. But now, replaying the memory with cold detachment, he saw the other details. He saw how Julian had poured him a drink immediately, a double scotch, before he had even looked at the first photo. He saw how Julian had stood over him, a hand on his shoulder, anchoring him, controlling the physical space. She has been distant lately, hasn't she? Julian had murmured, his voice a hypnotic rhythm. Spending late nights at the office? Changing her passwords? It all makes sense now, Michael. She is laughing at you. Julian had not just provided the evidence. He had provided the script for Michael's emotions. He had interpreted every innocent action of Emily's, a missed call, a tired sigh, a new dress, and twisted it into a narrative of deceit. He had weaponized Michael's deepest insecurity, the fear that he was unlovable, that he was only a wallet to be exploited. Michael opened his eyes, the anger in his chest cold and solid, like a block of ice. He turned to his computer, the screens glowing with the blue light of the Harrison Group's internal server. He needed to understand why. Jealousy was powerful, yes, but Julian was a creature of opportunity. There had to be more. He accessed the archived project files from 4 years ago. At the time, Emily had been spearheading the launch of the Harrison Diamond Tier wedding packages. It was a massive initiative, projected to bring in millions. Emily was the face of it, her taste and reputation driving the pre-sales. Michael scrolled through the email logs. 2 months before the affair was exposed, Emily had sent a memo to the board. Subject: vendor contracts for Diamond Tier. Content: after reviewing the proposals, I cannot recommend Right Events as the exclusive partner. Their margins are inflated, and the quality control does not meet Harrison standards. I suggest we open the bidding to other planners. Michael stared at the screen. He had never seen this email. He checked the distribution list. It had been sent to the board, but his own email address was in the BCC field, yet he had never opened it. He checked the server logs. The email had been deleted from his inbox 3 minutes after it arrived. Who had access to his email? Only 2 people: his executive assistant and the man who had set up his private server. Julian. It was not just about love or friendship. It was about business. Emily stood in the way of Julian's complete control over the Harrison Group's event contracts. She was the gatekeeper who saw through his inflated invoices and mediocre service. To secure the contract, Julian had to remove the gatekeeper. Michael's fingers flew across the keyboard now, hunting. He pulled up Julian's invoicing history. He cross-referenced the dates. The investigation into Emily had cost £50,000, billed to the company under market research. But where did the money go? He traced the transaction number. It flowed into a holding company in the Isle of Man. And from there, a series of smaller transfers. One to the actor, David Miller, and another, a substantial sum of £10,000, transferred on August 20th, 2020. The recipient was a freelance digital artist named Shadowboxer. Michael opened a new tab and searched for the handle. It belonged to a graphic designer specializing in photorealistic manipulation and visual effects. The portfolio was impressive, and right there, in the archived gallery of past projects, was a familiar image. It was a test render of a hotel corridor, the exact same corridor from the incriminating photos, but empty. The final piece of the puzzle snapped into place with a deafening click. Julian had hired a digital artist to create the background, hired an actor to play the lover, and used a body double for Emily. It was a production, a meticulously directed scene where Michael was the intended audience and the unwitting victim. And Emily? The memory of the confrontation in the foyer hit him. The day he threw her out. She had stood by the door, a small suitcase at her feet. She had tried to speak. Michael, please, just look at me. This is insane. I do not know who that man is. And Julian had stepped between them, his back to Emily, facing Michael. Do not listen to her gaslighting, Michael. Narcissists always deny. Just sign the papers and get her out of here before she takes half the company. Michael had looked at Julian's back, not Emily's face. He had trusted the friend who was stabbing him over the wife who would have died for him. A groan tore itself from Michael's throat, a raw, animal sound of agony. He buried his face in his hands. He had been so arrogant, so sure of his own intelligence. Yet he had been played like a cheap violin. He had destroyed the best thing in his life because his ego was too fragile to ask a single follow-up question. He looked back at the screen, at the transfer of funds that proved Julian's guilt. This was the smoking gun. This was the evidence that could send Julian to prison for fraud, embezzlement, and defamation. But prison was too good for Julian Wright. Michael slowly closed the laptop. The cold rage that had settled in his gut was sharpening into a plan. Julian wanted to be the center of attention. He wanted to be the star of the Harrison empire. Michael would give him exactly what he wanted. He picked up his phone and dialed his assistant. It was 3 a.m., but she answered on the first ring. "Mr. Harrison?" "Sarah," Michael said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I need you to set up a private dinner. Tomorrow night. Just me and Julian Wright. Tell him it is regarding the merger he has been pushing for. Tell him I am finally ready to sign everything over to his management." "Of course, sir. Shall I reserve the private room at Le Gavroche?" "No," Michael said, looking at the empty space where Emily's photo used to sit. "Have the chef prepare a table here in the penthouse. I want this to be intimate. I want him to feel safe." He hung up the phone. The rain continued to batter the glass, but Michael no longer felt the cold. He was burning with a purpose he had not felt in years. He would get the confession. He would record it. And then he would orchestrate an ending that Julian Wright never expected. The decision to destroy Julian Wright was made in the cold, blue light of the server room. But the courage to face Emily Foster had to be summoned from a place Michael Harrison had not visited in years, his conscience. He could not move forward with his vengeance until he had looked into the eyes of the woman he had sacrificed. He needed to understand the anatomy of her silence. Michael waited outside her apartment building in Southwark. It was a block of council estates, a brutalist concrete monolith that seemed to absorb the gray London sky. The streetlights flickered with an intermittent buzz, casting long, erratic shadows across the cracked pavement. His Bentley was parked 2 streets away. He did not want to insult her poverty with his luxury. He stood in the shadows of the entryway, wearing a dark overcoat, his collar turned up against the biting wind. It was past midnight when she appeared. She walked with a slow, heavy gait. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of a tote bag that looked as if it contained the burdens of the entire world. She was not wearing the crisp black uniform of the gala anymore. She was in jeans and an oversized sweater that had seen better days. As she fumbled for her keys in the dim light, Michael saw her hand tremble. It was a tremor of pure exhaustion. "Emily," he said. The sound of his voice did not make her jump. She simply froze, her hand hovering over the lock. She closed her eyes for a brief second, inhaling deeply, as if gathering the strength to deal with one final nuisance before she could collapse. When she turned to face him, her expression was not one of fear, but of profound weariness. "You are trespassing, Michael," she said, her voice rough from a day of shouting orders in a noisy kitchen. "If you are here to gloat about my living conditions, you can consider the box checked. I live in a hole. You live in a palace. You win. Now please move." Michael stepped out of the shadows, the yellow light illuminating the sharp planes of his face. He looked at her, really looked at her, searching for the deceit he had been told existed, but finding only a terrifying authenticity. "I am not here to gloat," Michael said quietly. "I am here because I need to ask you something. A question that has been haunting me since I saw you at the hotel." Emily let out a dry, humorless laugh. She leaned back against the heavy metal door, crossing her arms over her chest as a shield. "You have questions? After 3 years of silence? You had your lawyers ask the questions, Michael. I answered them. I signed the papers. I disappeared. Isn't that what you paid for? Why did you sign them?" Michael asked, his voice gaining a sudden intensity. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, needing to bridge the physical distance to bridge the emotional chasm. "That is what I cannot understand. If you were innocent, as you claimed in the beginning, why did you stop fighting? Why did you let me take everything without a single objection? You walked away with nothing. No alimony. No settlement. Why?" He was testing her. Even with the proof of Julian's treachery sitting in his safe, a small, damaged part of him needed to hear it from her lips. He needed to know if her silence was an admission of guilt or an act of martyrdom. Emily looked at him for a long, agonizing moment. The wind blew a strand of hair across her face, but she did not brush it away. Her eyes, once so full of warmth for him, were now 2 chips of flint. "You think I stopped fighting because I was guilty," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "You think I saw the evidence and realized I was caught." "Most people would fight for their reputation," Michael pressed. "Most people would scream." You went silent. "I screamed for 3 days, Michael," Emily whispered, the intensity of her voice cutting through the night air sharper than a knife. "I screamed when you locked me out of the bedroom. I screamed when you canceled my credit cards. I screamed when you refused to look at me during breakfast." She pushed herself off the door, stepping toward him, her exhaustion momentarily replaced by a cold, burning fire. "I stopped fighting the moment we walked into that courtroom," she continued, her voice steady and devastating. "I looked at you. I looked at the man I had shared my bed with, the man I had nursed through pneumonia, the man I held when his father died. I looked at you, and I saw that you were not looking at me. You were looking at Julian. You were looking at the papers. You were looking at your lawyers." She took a breath that shuddered in her chest. "I realized then that it did not matter if I proved the photos were fake. It did not matter if I had an alibi, because you had already decided I was capable of betraying you. The trust was not just broken, it was vaporized. If I had fought you, Michael, I would have been fighting for your money. I would have been fighting for a house. But I could not fight for our marriage, because you had already killed it. You chose to believe a lie because it was easier than trusting your wife." Michael felt as if the ground were opening up beneath his feet. Her words stripped him bare, peeling away the layers of his arrogance. She was right. He had not investigated. He had not asked her for her side. He had accepted the narrative that fed his insecurity. "I did not take your money," Emily said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "because I did not want anything that came from a man who thought so little of me. I would rather scrub floors and take the bus and eat stale bread than take a single pound from a husband who treated me like a prostitute he could discard." The silence that followed was absolute. The city noises seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of Michael's heart hammering against his ribs. He stood there, a billionaire in a cashmere coat, feeling smaller and poorer than he ever had in his life. "Emily," he choked out, his voice cracking. I did not know." "You did not want to know," she corrected him. She turned back to the door, her keys jangling in the silence. "Go home, Michael. Go back to your glass tower. You have your empire. You have your loyal friend Julian. You have everything you wanted." "Wait," Michael said, reaching out a hand but stopping short of touching her. He felt unworthy of touching her. Let me at least help you now. You are struggling. I can see it. Let me write you a check. Let me get you out of this place. Please." It was a clumsy, desperate offer, born of guilt and panic. He wanted to fix it the only way he knew how, with money. Emily paused, the key in the lock. She did not look back. "Keep your money," she said, her voice flat and final. "I am surviving. I am rebuilding. And I am doing it with clean hands. Can you say the same, Michael?" The heavy door clicked open. She stepped inside, into the dim, smelling hallway of the tenement building. "Emily," he called out one last time, a desperate plea. She turned her head slightly, her profile illuminated by the harsh hallway light. "Goodbye, Michael. Do not come back here. We have nothing left to say to each other." The door slammed shut with a metallic clang that echoed like a gunshot in the empty street. Michael Harrison stood alone in the dark, the rain beginning to fall again, mixing with the hot, stinging tears that finally spilled from his eyes. He stared at the closed door, realizing the magnitude of his loss. He had thought he was the victim. He had thought he was the judge. But as he stood in the cold, he realized he was just the fool who had burned down his own home to kill a spider. He turned and walked back toward his car, his steps heavy. The sorrow in his chest was crushing, but beneath it, a new emotion was hardening, cold and sharp as a diamond. Emily was right. He had been blind. He had been weak. But he could not change the past. He could only change the ending. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen glowed in the darkness. He brought up the contact for the head of security at the Harrison Group. "It is me," Michael said, his voice void of any emotion. "Prepare the boardroom for tomorrow evening. And make sure the audiovisual equipment is connected to the main server. I have a presentation to make." He looked back at Emily's building one last time. He could not save their marriage. She had made that clear. But he could avenge her. And he would start by tearing Julian Wright's world apart, brick by brick. The preparation for the dinner felt less like arranging a meal and more like setting a stage for a high-stakes execution. Michael Harrison stood in the center of his penthouse living room, adjusting the cuff of his shirt with a precision that betrayed the trembling rage beneath his skin. The room was dim, lit only by the soft, ambient glow of the city skyline, drifting through the floor-to-ceiling windows and the flickering flames of the modern gas fireplace. It was an atmosphere designed for intimacy, for secrets, and for the kind of brotherhood Julian Wright thrived upon. Michael had dismissed the staff for the evening. He wanted no witnesses, no interruptions, and no one to sense the lethal tension radiating from him. On the sideboard, a bottle of Chateau Margaux 1996 sat open, breathing, its dark ruby contents waiting to loosen the tongue of the man who had destroyed his life. Hidden discreetly behind the spine of a first-edition Hemingway on the bookshelf was a high-fidelity microphone. Another was taped beneath the marble overhang of the kitchen island. The cameras, usually reserved for security, had been recalibrated to focus on the seating area, their recording lights taped over to ensure total darkness. When the doorbell chimed, the sound was sharp and intrusive. Michael took a deep breath, smoothing the mask of the weary, grateful friend over his features. He walked to the door and pulled it open. Julian stood there, looking every inch the master of the universe. He wore a midnight blue velvet tuxedo jacket, a silk scarf draped casually around his neck, and a smile that was all teeth and charm. He held a bottle of scotch in one hand, a peace offering that felt more like a prop. "Michael!" Julian exclaimed, stepping inside and clapping Michael on the shoulder with a familiarity that made Michael's skin crawl. "You look terrible, my friend. Absolutely exhausted. I told you, you worked too hard. But tonight we drink." "You are right, Julian," Michael said, forcing a weak smile as he led him into the living room. "I am tired. That is actually why I asked you to come over. I have come to a decision about the future of the Harrison Group, and I could not make it without you." Julian's eyes lit up, a predatory gleam flickering in the depths of his pupils. He sensed weakness. He smelled opportunity. "A decision? Sounds serious. Here, let me pour." They settled into the leather armchairs facing the fireplace. Julian poured the wine with the reverence of a priest, swirling the glass and inhaling the bouquet. Michael watched him, remembering how many times they had sat like this, how many times he had trusted this man with his deepest fears. It was nauseating to realize that every vulnerability he had ever shown Julian had been filed away, sharpened, and used as a weapon against him. "So," Julian said, taking a long, languid sip, "tell me, what is weighing on the great Michael Harrison?" Michael leaned back, letting his shoulders slump. He stared into the fire, avoiding Julian's gaze to hide the cold calculation in his own eyes. "I saw Emily," he lied smoothly. "Or I thought I did. On the street the other day. It brought it all back, Julian. The betrayal. The anger. I realized I have been running on fumes for 3 years. I cannot do it anymore. The merger with the Ritz-Carlton Group? The expansion into Dubai? I do not have the stomach for it." Julian leaned forward, his interest piqued, like a shark sensing blood in the water. "What are you saying, Michael?" "I am saying I want to step back," Michael said, turning to look Julian in the eye. "I want to take a sabbatical. Maybe a year. Maybe forever. But I cannot leave the company to a board of directors who only care about share prices. I need someone who understands the vision. Someone who has been there since the beginning." He let the sentence hang in the air, a golden apple dangling just within reach. Julian set his glass down, his hand trembling slightly. This was it. The moment he had been manipulating Michael toward for a decade. "Michael, are you suggesting?" "I want to appoint you as interim CEO," Michael said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "Full control. The event planning division, the hotels, the assets. I trust you, Julian. You are the only one who ever looked out for me. You saved me from Emily. God knows where I would be if you hadn't opened my eyes." Julian sat back, exhaling a long, shuddering breath of ecstasy. He reached for the bottle and poured himself another glass, filling it to the brim. The alcohol was working. The ego, already massive, was now expanding to fill the room. I didn't I? Julian murmured, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. I really did save you. She was a cancer, Michael. A beautiful, malignant tumor. If I hadn't stepped in, you would be pushing a stroller in some suburban nightmare right now, instead of ruling the world. It still hurts, though, Michael whispered, baiting the trap. Sometimes I wonder, was she really that bad? The evidence was so damning, but sometimes I wonder if I was too harsh. Too harsh. Julian laughed, a sharp, barking sound. He stood up and began to pace the room, the wine glass swaying dangerously in his hand. You were not harsh enough. She was laughing at you, Michael. I saw it. I saw the way she looked at you. But the photos, Michael pressed gently. You found them so quickly. It was a miracle you were there. It was not a miracle. Julian slurred slightly, turning to face him, his eyes bright with the intoxication of power. It was necessity. You were blind. You were so in love with her, so pathetic in your devotion. I knew I had to do something drastic to wake you up. I had to show you the truth, even if I had to help the truth along a little bit. Michael's heart stopped. The room went dead silent. The fire crackled. The recording devices were spinning. Help it along? Michael asked, his voice barely a whisper. What do you mean? Julian waved his hand dismissively, the alcohol loosening the final bolts of his caution. He felt safe. He was about to be king. What did it matter now? Oh, don't look so shocked. The world isn't black and white, Michael. It is about results. Emily was going to ruin the business. She was blocking the diamond tier contracts. She hated me. She wanted to cut me out. So I took care of it. I hired the right people. I created the scenario. I gave you the exit strategy you needed. He took another drink, obliterating the last of his filter. That actor? The one in the photos? Expensive, but worth every penny. And the digital work? Masterful. I did you a favor, Michael. I cut off the limb to save the body. And look at you now. You are free. And tomorrow, you are giving me the keys to the kingdom. It was all worth it. Julian raised his glass in a toast to his own brilliance. To us. To the future. And to the end of Emily Foster. Michael stared at the man he had called brother. He felt a cold, metallic calm settle over him. He had it. He had the confession. He had the motive. He had the admission of the fraud, the bribery, the destruction of an innocent woman's life, all recorded in high definition. Michael stood up slowly. He walked over to the sideboard and picked up the bottle of wine. He poured the remainder of the expensive vintage into his own glass, his movements steady and precise. You are right, Julian, Michael said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the tremor of weakness he had feigned all evening. It was all worth it, because now I know exactly who you are. Julian blinked, sensing the shift in tone. Michael, the merger meeting tomorrow, Michael said, looking at the red wine swirling in his glass. It will be quite the event. Everyone will be there. The board, the press, the police. The police? Julian frowned, a flicker of unease penetrating his drunken haze. Why would the police be there? Security, Michael said, finally looking at Julian with eyes that were no longer friendly. They were the eyes of an executioner. We want to make sure the transition of power is handled correctly. He raised his glass. To the end, Julian. You have no idea what is coming. Julian laughed nervously, but the sound died in his throat. He looked at Michael, really looked at him, and for the first time that night, the predator felt a chill run down his spine. But it was too late. The trap had not just been set, it had snapped shut. The grand ballroom of the Harrison Hotel in London had been transformed into a theater of opulence, a gilded cage designed to hold the city's financial and social predators. Crystal chandeliers, massive and dripping with diamonds of light, hung suspended over a sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns. The air was thick with the scent of lilies, expensive champagne, and the electric hum of anticipation. To the hundreds of guests gathered, board members, investors, key stakeholders, and the hungry press, this was a night of celebration. Rumors of a massive merger had been circulating for weeks, and the whispers suggested that Michael Harrison was finally ready to name a successor to run the day-to-day operations of his empire. Julian Wright moved through the crowd like a monarch in waiting. He was radiant. His tuxedo was bespoke, cut from a midnight blue silk that shimmered under the lights, and his smile was a practiced weapon of charm. He gripped hands, kissed cheeks, and accepted premature congratulations with a humble nod that fooled everyone but the man watching him from the shadows of the stage wing. To Julian, this evening was his coronation. He believed he had won the long game. He believed the man standing backstage, adjusting his tie in the mirror, was a broken king ready to surrender his crown. Michael Harrison stepped out from the wings. He paused for a moment, letting the silence of the room gather around him. He looked out at the sea of faces, his expression unreadable, carved from cold marble. He saw Julian standing near the front, flanked by two board members, holding a flute of champagne as if it were a scepter. Julian caught his eye and winked, a gesture of conspiratorial brotherhood that made Michael's stomach turn. Michael walked to the podium. The spotlight hit him, blindingly white, isolating him from the rest of the world. He gripped the edges of the lectern, his knuckles white. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael began, his voice amplified and resonating through the vast hall. "Thank you for joining me tonight. For the past decade, the Harrison Group has been synonymous with excellence, with luxury, and, above all, with integrity." A polite ripple of applause moved through the room. Julian clapped the loudest, beaming with pride. "Tonight was supposed to be about a merger," Michael continued, his voice dropping a register, becoming grave. "It was supposed to be about the future. But we cannot build a future if the foundation is rotten. We cannot move forward until we have cleansed the past." The room went still. The applause died instantly. Julian's smile faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing his brow. He took a half-step forward, sensing a deviation from the script. "3 years ago," Michael said, locking eyes with Julian, "I made a decision that destroyed my family. I divorced my wife, Emily Foster, based on irrefutable evidence of her infidelity. I cast her out. I ruined her reputation. I believed I was the victim of a great betrayal." Murmurs broke out. Why was he bringing up the scandal? Julian's face drained of color. He made a sharp, cutting motion with his hand, signaling Michael to stop, mouthing the word no. "But I was wrong," Michael declared, his voice cutting through the whispers like a blade. "I was not the victim of a cheating wife. I was the victim of a parasite." Michael pressed a button on the console hidden within the lectern. The massive LED screen behind him, which displayed the Harrison Group logo, flickered and changed. It did not show stock projections or architectural renderings. Instead, a grainy, high-contrast video appeared. It was the recording from the penthouse, taken the night before. The audio boomed through the ballroom's state-of-the-art sound system, crystal clear and damning. "I really did save you. She was a cancer, Michael. I hired the right people. I created the scenario. That actor? Expensive, but worth every penny. And the digital work? Masterful." The voice was unmistakably Julian's. The arrogance, the slur of the alcohol, the cruel laughter. It echoed off the vaulted ceilings, bouncing around the room like a trapped bird. On the floor, Julian froze. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor, the sound sharp and violent in the stunned silence. He looked around wildly, seeing hundreds of pairs of eyes turning toward him, not with admiration, but with horror and disgust. "Turn it off," Julian screamed, his voice cracking. "It is a lie. It is a deep fake. He is insane." But Michael did not turn it off. He pressed another button. The screen shifted again. Now, it displayed bank statements. They were blown up to massive size, highlighting the transfers from Julian Wright's personal accounts to the shell companies, and finally to the actor, David Miller, and the digital artist. The dates were highlighted in red. The amounts were undeniable. "Julian Wright," Michael said, his voice calm, acting as the narrator of Julian's destruction. "Embezzlement of company funds to the tune of £2 million. Fraud, defamation, and conspiracy to commit blackmail." Julian tried to run. He shoved a waiter aside, scrambling toward the side exit, his dignity forgotten, reduced to a desperate animal trying to escape a trap. But the doors swung open before he could reach them. Two officers from the Metropolitan Police, accompanied by Detective Thorne, stepped into the ballroom. They were not smiling. They blocked Julian's path, their presence solid and immovable. "Julian Wright," one of the officers said, his voice carrying over the stunned crowd. "You are under arrest." The scene that followed was a blur of chaotic motion. The flashbulbs of the press cameras, which had been dormant, erupted into a blinding storm of white light. They captured every second of Julian's downfall, the handcuffs clicking around his wrists, his face twisted in a rictus of rage and terror, his screaming accusations that Michael was the devil. Michael watched from the stage, feeling nothing. No triumph. No joy. Just a cold, hollow sense of completion. He watched as the man who had been his best friend, the man who had whispered poison into his ear for years, was dragged out of the ballroom, his velvet tuxedo now just a costume for a criminal. The doors closed behind the police, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. The guests stared at Michael, waiting for an explanation, for a joke, for something to normalize the madness they had just witnessed. Michael looked at them. These were the people who had shunned Emily. These were the people who had laughed at the rumors Julian spread. They were all complicit in their silence. "The merger is canceled," Michael said into the microphone, his voice weary. "The bar is open. Good night." He stepped away from the podium and walked off the stage, ignoring the shout of questions from the reporters, ignoring the board members rushing toward him with panic in their eyes. He walked straight through the backstage corridor, down the service elevator, and out into the cool night air of the loading dock. He leaned against the brick wall, loosening his tie, gasping for air. He had done it. He had cleared her name. Tomorrow, every newspaper in London would run the story of Julian's treachery and Emily's innocence. The world would know she was a victim. But as he looked up at the indifferent moon, Michael realized the terrible truth. Public vindication was not the same as personal forgiveness. He had destroyed Julian, yes. He had burned the weeds from his garden. But the garden was still empty. The house was still quiet. And the woman he loved was still sleeping in a council flat in Southwark, miles away from the man who had finally learned how to fight for her, 3 years too late. He took out his phone. He had one more call to make, one more arrangement to secure. He could not buy her love back. He knew that now. But he could try to pay the debt. The morning headlines screamed the name of Julian Wright in bold, black ink, detailing his arrest and the spectacular implosion of his career, but Michael Harrison barely glanced at the papers spread across his mahogany dining table. The vindication of the previous night, the public destruction of the man who had orchestrated his misery, had burned hot and fast, like a flare, leaving behind only the cold ash of reality. He had cleared the weeds from the garden, yes, but he was still standing in a wasteland. The silence of the penthouse was no longer just quiet. It was judgmental. Every sleek surface and designer chair seemed to whisper the accusation that he had been a fool, a king who had beheaded his queen on the word of a jester. Michael dressed with the solemnity of a man preparing for a funeral or a wedding, unsure which one awaited him. He chose a suit that was less aggressive than his usual corporate armor, a softer navy wool, a white shirt with no tie. He wanted to look approachable. He wanted to look like a husband, not a CEO. In his briefcase, he placed a single, thick folder. It contained the culmination of a frantic night of work with his personal attorneys, who had been summoned out of their beds at 3 a.m. to draft the documents Michael now carried like a holy relic. He did not take the Bentley. He called for a standard town car, instructing the driver to take him to Southwark. The journey felt interminable. As the gleaming towers of the financial district faded into the grittier, worn-down streets of the borough where Emily lived, Michael practiced his speech. He rehearsed the apology he had been crafting in his mind for 48 hours. He imagined the scene. He would knock. She would open the door. He would present the folder, and the wall of ice between them would finally, mercifully, shatter. He believed in the power of grand gestures. He believed that if the injury was massive, the bandage must be equally colossal. When he arrived at the council estate, the midday sun was doing its best to brighten the gray concrete. but the building remained stubborn in its bleakness. Michael walked up the 3 flights of stairs, the smell of damp plaster and old cooking oil clinging to the air. He reached her door, number 3B, and knocked. It took a long time for the door to open. When it finally did, Emily stood there, holding a mug of tea, wearing a simple, oversized sweater and leggings. She did not look surprised to see him. In fact, she looked as if she had been expecting him, resigning herself to the inevitability of his persistence. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red-rimmed, suggesting she had seen the news, or perhaps she had been crying. But her posture was upright, her chin lifted in that defiant, quiet dignity that Michael now recognized as her greatest strength. "I saw the papers," she said softly, before he could speak. She stepped back, leaving the door open, a silent invitation that was less about welcome and more about finishing a conversation that had started 3 years ago. Michael stepped into the small studio apartment. It was clean, meticulously organized, but heartbreakingly small. A single bed was pushed against the wall, serving as a sofa during the day. A small table held a stack of books and a laptop. It was a life condensed into a box. "I did it for you," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. He stood in the center of the room, clutching the briefcase. "I wanted the world to know. I wanted everyone who whispered your name to choke on their words. Julian is finished, Emily. He will never hurt anyone again." Emily set her mug down on the table. She looked at him with a gaze that was unreadable, not grateful, not angry, just profoundly sad. "I know you did, Michael, and I suppose I should thank you for clearing my name. It will make finding a job easier. But you didn't have to destroy him so publicly. You didn't have to turn it into a show. He deserved it," Michael said, a flash of his old ruthlessness surfacing. "He took 3 years of our lives. He took them because you gave them to him," Emily corrected gently. She sat down on the edge of the bed, folding her hands in her lap. "But that is done. The past is dead, Michael. Why are you here today?" Michael took a breath. This was the moment. He moved to the small table and placed the briefcase down, clicking the latches open. He pulled out the thick legal folder and laid it before her. "I am here to make it right," Michael said. "I know I cannot undo the pain. I know I cannot buy back the time, but I can restore what was stolen from you." He opened the folder. On top lay a cashier's check. The number on it was staggering, £25 million. It was exactly half of his current net worth, liquidated and secured. Beneath it were the deeds to the house they had shared in Kensington, the one he had kept and left empty for 3 years. "This is yours," Michael said, his voice trembling slightly. "Half. It is what you would have received if I hadn't been a fool. If we had divorced fairly. I want you to have it. I want you to have the house. I want you to have security. You never have to work another shift in a kitchen again. You never have to worry about rent. You are free." He looked at her, waiting for the reaction. He expected tears. He expected shock. He expected her to cover her mouth and look at him with the realization that he was trying, truly trying, to fix the world for her. Emily looked down at the check. She stared at the zeros for a long time. The room was so quiet Michael could hear the ticking of a cheap plastic clock on the wall. She reached out a hand, her fingers hovering over the paper, tracing the sharp edge of the check. "25 million, she whispered. "That is a lot of money, Michael." "It is only money," Michael said quickly, stepping closer, dropping to one knee so he could look into her face. "It is nothing compared to you. I want you to come home, Emily. Not to the Kensington house, unless you want to. We can go anywhere. We can start over. I have changed. I see things clearly now. I see you." He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against her skin. Her hand was cold. She did not pull away, but she did not squeeze back. She remained perfectly still, looking at the check, not at him. "You think this is a solution," she said, her voice sounding distant, as if she were speaking from another room. "You think this makes us even." "I think it is a start," Michael pleaded. "I am not trying to buy you, Emily. I am trying to show you that I value you, that I acknowledge the wrong I did. Please, take it. Let me take care of you again." Emily slowly lifted her eyes to meet his. The look in them stopped Michael's heart. It was not hatred. It was worse. It was a terrifying, hollow clarity. "You still don't understand," she said softly. You think the tragedy of our marriage was that I lost the money. You think the injustice was that I lost the lifestyle. So you bring me the money and the house, and you think the equation is balanced. She picked up the check. She held it in her hand, feeling the weight of the paper that represented a lifetime of luxury. I will take it, Emily said. Michael let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, a massive rush of relief flooding his chest. A smile broke across his face, a desperate, hopeful smile. You will? Oh, Emily, thank God. We can. I will take it, she interrupted, her voice firm, cutting through his joy. Because I earned it. I earned it every time you chose work over me. I earned it every time I swallowed my pride. And I earned it during the last 3 years of hell that you inflicted on me. This isn't a gift, Michael. And it isn't an apology. It is back pay. Michael's smile faltered. He stayed on his knee, frozen by the change in her tone. And the house? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I will take the deed, she said, closing the folder. It is a good asset. It will sell well. Sell? Michael blinked. But I thought we could. Emily stood up, clutching the folder to her chest. She looked down at him, the man who had once been her entire world, and shook her head slowly. There is no we, Michael, she said, delivering the words with a gentleness that made them hurt more than a scream. You destroyed us the moment you believed Julian over me. You can fix my bank account. You can fix my reputation. But you cannot fix the fact that when I needed you to be my husband, you chose to be my judge. She walked to the door and held it open. The sunlight from the hallway spilled in, creating a silhouette of freedom. I accept the settlement, she said. Thank you for bringing it. Now, please leave. I have packing to do. Michael stood up. His legs felt heavy, like lead. He looked at the check in her hand, then at her face. He realized with a sickening jolt that he had miscalculated everything. He had brought a dragon's hoard of gold to a woman who only wanted to be seen. He had won the war against Julian, but he had lost the war for Emily's heart long before he ever walked up those stairs. He walked to the door. As he passed her, he paused, smelling the familiar scent of her soap, a scent that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I love you, he whispered, a final, desperate prayer. I know, Emily replied, her voice devoid of cruelty, but empty of hope. But you love your pride more, and that is why you are leaving alone. Michael walked out into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind him, a soft sound that echoed with the finality of a coffin lid closing. He walked down the stairs, the check for £25 million no longer in his possession, yet he felt infinitely poorer than when he had arrived. He had given her everything, and in return, she had given him exactly what he deserved, nothing but the truth. The departure board at St. Pancras International Station flickered with a rhythmic, mechanical hum, listing destinations that promised escape: Brussels, Amsterdam, Lille, Paris. Under the soaring Victorian glass roof, the station was a cathedral of transit, filled with the echoing footsteps of travelers and the low murmur of goodbyes. Emily Foster stood near the champagne bar, a flute of vintage brewed in her hand, watching the world rush by. She wore a trench coat the color of sand, belted tightly at the waist, and a silk scarf that caught the light. Items purchased just yesterday, the first indulgences of a new life. She looked different. The exhaustion that had etched deep lines into her face during her years of exile in Southwark had begun to fade, smoothed away by the restorative power of sleep and, more importantly, security. The check Michael had given her, that terrifying, liberating slip of paper, had been deposited. The funds were secure in a Swiss account, untouchable, just like her heart. She had sold the Kensington house within a week to a Russian oligarch who didn't care about the ghosts in the master bedroom. She had liquidated the assets of her past life with the cold efficiency of a surgeon removing a gangrenous limb. A vibration in her pocket drew her attention. She pulled out her phone. It was a notification from her solicitor. Final decree absolute issued. You are legally a single woman, Miss Foster. She stared at the screen, expecting a wave of grief, or perhaps a surge of triumph. Instead, she felt a profound, quiet lightness. It was the feeling of setting down a heavy rucksack after a 10-mile hike. She didn't hate Michael anymore. Hate required energy. Hate was a form of attachment. What she felt now was a distant, dull pity, like one might feel for a bird that had flown into a window pane. A tragedy of blindness. Platform 5 for the 14:30 Eurostar to Paris Gare du Nord is now open for boarding, the announcer's voice echoed. Emily finished her champagne in one smooth swallow. She picked up her new leather carry-on, turned her back on London, and walked toward the gates. She did not look over her shoulder. There was no one there to wave goodbye, and for the first time in her life, that solitude felt not like loneliness, but like freedom. Understood. Across the city. In the glass-walled boardroom of the Harrison Luxury Group, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Michael Harrison sat at the head of the long obsidian table. The room was full of executives, lawyers, and PR consultants, but it felt empty. The chair to his right, where Julian Wright used to sit, had been removed entirely, leaving a conspicuous gap in the symmetry of the room. The stock has rebounded, Mr. Harrison, the chief financial officer said, his voice trembling slightly. The public exposure of Mr. Wright's fraud has, ironically, boosted consumer confidence. The market sees you as a crusader for integrity. Bookings for the next quarter are up 15%. Michael stared at the man, but he didn't really see him. He saw a moving mouth, a blur of a tie, a meaningless stream of data. 15%, Michael repeated, his voice flat. That is good. It is excellent, sir. The PR director chimed in, eager to please the king. And the media narrative has shifted. You are the tragic hero, the billionaire who was deceived by his best friend but fought for the truth. It is a perfect story. We have interview requests from Forbes, The Times, Vanity Fair. No interviews, Michael said, standing up abruptly. The chair legs scraped against the floor with a harsh screech that made everyone flinch. Cancel them all. But sir, I said cancel them. Michael snapped, the cold fury in his eyes silencing the room instantly. We are a hotel chain, not a reality television show. Get back to work. He walked out of the boardroom, leaving his executives staring at one another in fearful confusion. He strode down the corridor, his footsteps heavy on the plush carpet. He took the private elevator up to the penthouse, the fortress of solitude he had fought so hard to keep in the divorce. When the doors opened, the silence of the apartment hit him like a physical blow. It was immaculate. The cleaners had been there this morning. The surfaces gleamed. The air smelled of expensive diffusers, sandalwood, and bergamot. It was perfect. It was dead. Michael walked to the wet bar and poured himself a whiskey. He didn't drink it. He just held the glass, the cold crystal numbing his fingers. He walked to the window and looked out at the sprawling gray expanse of London. Somewhere out there, amidst the millions of lights, Emily was gone. He had checked the flight manifests and train logs, a habit of control he couldn't break. He knew she was on the train to Paris. He knew she was gone. He looked around the room. This was the prize. This was what Julian had told him to protect. Don't let her take half, Michael. She wants your money. He let out a short, bitter laugh that echoed in the empty room. She hadn't wanted his money. She had wanted him. And when he proved himself worthless, she had taken the money as a consolation prize. He thought about the check. 25 million pounds. A fortune to most, a dent to him. But it wasn't the money that mattered. It was what the transaction represented. She had allowed him to buy his way out of his guilt, but she had refused to let him buy his way back into her heart. She had taken the cash and left him with the one thing he couldn't bear, himself. He walked over to the fireplace, where the digital frames cycled through photos of his properties, the Harrison New York, the Harrison Dubai, the Harrison Tokyo. Monuments to his ego. He realized now that he was the poorest man on earth. He had billions in the bank, but he had no one to tell about his day. He had no one to adjust his tie before a gala. He had no one to give him a cheap pair of cufflinks shaped like paper airplanes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out that tarnished silver cufflink. He had carried it with him every day since he found it. He looked at the small, cheap metal toy. This is so you remember to always fly back home. I have no home, Michael whispered to the empty room. The realization was absolute and crushing. A house was not a home. A hotel was not a home. Home was the person who looked at you and saw the man, not the CEO. And he had exiled his home to Paris. Underscore 3 months later, in the Marais district of Paris, the spring sun was dappling the cobblestones with gold. The air smelled of roasting coffee and blooming jasmine. Emily sat at a small, round table outside a cafe, a sketchbook open before her. She was designing a wedding, not a massive, corporate spectacle like the one she used to manage for Harrison, but a small, intimate affair for a young couple she had met at a gallery. She looked different. Her hair was cut shorter, a chic bob that framed her face. She wore a simple white blouse and jeans. She looked younger. Mademoiselle. A waiter placed a café crème on her table. Un café crème. Merci. Emily smiled. Her French was improving. She picked up her pen and began to sketch an archway of flowers. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a news alert. She had forgotten to turn off the Google alerts for her old name. Michael Harrison announces indefinite sabbatical from Harrison Group. Shares dip as CEO steps down to pursue personal reflection. Emily stared at the headline. A year ago, reading about Michael's stumble would have given her a vindictive thrill. Now, she just felt a mild, distant curiosity. He was stepping down. He was looking for answers. She hoped, for his sake, he found them. But she knew that the answers weren't in a boardroom, and they certainly weren't in a bank account. She swiped the notification away, deleting the alert permanently. She didn't need to know anymore. That story, the story of the cheating wife, the angry husband, the scheming friend, was a book she had finished reading. She had closed the cover and put it back on the shelf. She looked up from her phone and watched a couple walking hand in hand down the street. They were laughing at something, their heads bent close together in a private world. Emily didn't feel a pang of envy. She felt a glimmer of hope. She was 32 years old. She was wealthy, independent, and for the first time in years, she was whole. She picked up her cup, the warmth seeping into her fingers. She took a sip of the coffee, tasting the sweetness of the milk and the bitterness of the espresso. It tasted like life. Back in London, the rain began to fall against the glass of the penthouse, streaking the view of the city until it was nothing but a gray blur. Inside, Michael Harrison sat in the dark, watching the lights of the city flicker and die, the king of a vast, silent empire, ruling over a kingdom of dust. The title of his life story had been wrong, he realized. His wife hadn't taken everything in the divorce. She had left him with everything he thought he wanted, only for him to discover that without her, everything was nothing. And that was the ending she never expected, and the ending he would have to live with forever. This story is a brutal reminder that trust is like a mirror. Once you shatter it, no amount of money or apologies can ever make the reflection perfect again. Michael thought he could put a price tag on forgiveness, but he learned the hard way that dignity is the one asset you cannot buy. Emily taking the money wasn't greed. It was justice for the time she lost. Yet she knew that returning to a man who didn't believe in her would be the ultimate betrayal of herself. It is a powerful lesson that sometimes the best revenge is simply to be happy, wealthy, and far away from the people who doubted you. What would you have done if you were Emily? Would you have taken the $25 million and forgiven him? Or would you have walked away just like she did? I want to know your honest thoughts. Also, comment down below which city or state you are watching this video from. I love seeing how far our community reaches. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode. Thanks for watching.